Hello, everybody, and welcome to this fantastic, beautiful, inspiring, just is a great conversation. However, I essentially have an apology for you, the watchers of this, and particularly those of you who are YouTube orientated as opposed to Spotify, podcast platform of whatever preference you like orientated. The apology, though, is on behalf of Zoom. Our dear friends at Zoom, about whom I'm going to try and not rant. But essentially, Zoom didn't capture Michael's side of the video of the conversation. We started, and when we moved on to the additional audio platform that we used, something in Zoom's platform broke, and the entire video is just me, which of course is not what this is all about. So I've included in here just a very brief segment, just essentially a bit of social proof that Michael Bungay Stanier does exist and was involved in this conversation, and that it is a real deal. Because I appreciate that in previous episodes, we've had as many views on YouTube as we have had across the podcast platforms. So I get that this is important to many of you and you want to see it. But what's been disappointing in particular has been the complete lack of engagement that I've had from Zoom's support team. In actual fact, the only engagement I've had them have been automated ticket responses, basically saying we're not dealing with this problem right now. Good luck, which has been disappointing to say the least. So I'm actively researching what else I can use other than Zoom to capture these video conversations moving forward. So apologies. Sorry that whilst there's a video here for you to see and interact with, it is somewhat one-sided. The audio is there. You can see my response to what Michael's saying. I hope that'll be helpful, but I didn't want to hold back on the video entirely, and I hope that, you know, at least it's a contribution to the platform that we all know and love, being video and YouTube. So here it is, the one-sided video conversation with myself and the wonderful, the great, the inspiring Michael Bungay Stanier.
Perfect. All right, I'll just see you on Zencaster in 2 secs.
So welcome, Michael Bungay Stanier, to Better World Leaders. Thank you for making some time in your hectic schedule.
I am very happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
And I mean, I'm knowingly being facetious there. I like to sort of enter these conversations by asking people essentially what's out the window. So where are you at the moment, Michael?
You know, I've had an unchanging view out my window for 11 days because I'm on day 11 of quarantine in Sydney. I live in Toronto, Canada normally. I'm en route to Canberra, Australia's capital, down to see my parents. And I decided it was worth the trip and the hassle of flying, because you can't fly direct. So I fly from Canada to Toronto to Chicago, Chicago to Tokyo, Tokyo to Sydney. And now I'm doing my time in this hotel. One of the saving graces is I actually have an amazing view out my window. It's looking over Darling Harbour. If you know Sydney at all, I can see the tower. I can see the central business district right there. And I'm facing, I guess, east. So I see the sunrise in the morning, and then I see dusk come up over a night. So it's actually an amazing view, but it is also very unchanging because I'm literally locked in a hotel, so I haven't moved out of this view for 11 days.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many conversations like this happening around the world at the moment. One of the first guests that we had on the show was in a similar situation in Singapore, in his own apartment, but he'd flown in from overseas right at the start of everything. And it's just an unusual moment in the human experience to have all these sort of prison moments in effect.
Well, here's another way of framing it. I think it's unusual. It is really unusual for, you know, kind of lucky, privileged first worlders like me to be going, okay, you're shut down for 3 months or 6 months and you're in a hotel for 14 days. Part of me is going, what's the life of a Syrian refugee like when you're in a refugee camp where you have, like, I'm in a posh hotel room. I have an amazing view. I have food delivered 3 times a day. I've got a skipping rope so I can do some exercising. I've got an app so I can do some yoga. You know, this, as far as, you know, prison cells go, this is pretty damn luxurious. And there's just a lot of people who live a life of restraint and constraint and deprivation on an ongoing basis that I don't even get to think about most of the time. So, I pretty much won the game in terms of what it means to be in quarantine.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the comments that somebody made that I was talking to a few months ago, a client of mine who similarly flown back in from the US and had to self-isolate at home, and their observation was, this period in lockdown that so much, sort of distress is being caused by, to me, I recognize as being the equivalent of a once in a lifetime holiday for the majority of the world's population, who live in abject whatever it is. And I think if anything, it's actually a reflective opportunity, exactly as you've described it.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for making the time. And I mean, as a guy like you who travels a lot to interact with people in various different places, the immediate suggestion to just for a moment allow my monster, that no doubt we'll touch on at some point. There's a great app that I use every time I stay in a hotel, which is the 7-minute workout.
Yeah, nice.
You literally just need a floor space and a chair, and you can kind of do a whole body workout in a hotel room in 7 minutes.
Yeah, I know it. It's great.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll put the monster back to bed for a moment. So Michael, could you just give us, for anybody who's not aware of you, of course, there's probably one or two out there that haven't come across your work.
Probably like 99.9993% of the world's population have no idea who I am. So really quickly, I'm Michael Bungay Stanier. I am best known for a couple of books I've written. One is called The Coaching Habit. It came out about 4 years ago, 2016. And it's gone on to become a kind of big smash hit, I guess, in the world of coaching. It's closing in on 1 million copies now. And it's really a commitment to make coaching unweird, make it accessible, make it feel practical, make it feel like an everyday tool for everyday people. And that's kind of taken off. And I put out a new book a few months ago called The Advice Trap, which is a supplement or a kind of complement to that. Based on all of this, I founded a training company 20 years ago called Box of Crayons, and it's about championing curiosity within big organizations, helping them move from advice-driven to curiosity-led. And then if you keep rewinding the spiel, I'm actually Australian, grew up in Canberra, went to the Australian National University, won a Rhodes Scholarship, which was a great thing because it stopped me becoming a lawyer because I was on track to finishing a law degree and I'd have been a terrible lawyer. And I met my Canadian wife when I was studying at Oxford. And, I worked in the world of innovation and creativity for a while, in the world of change management, helping organizations evolve and change. And then about 20 years ago, established Box of Crayons, which has gone on to become this training company.
Yeah, and we will continue the sort of the stepping stones right to your current position and journey, but we'll just kind of hold back on that for the time being. So, I mean, I was just absolutely delighted and thrilled to have this opportunity to talk with you. And, certainly one of the things that I've very much benefited from, as somebody who, from a relatively young age has been put in a position where people would ask me questions and look for something, which for most of the part I would sort of be a bit taken aback by and go, really? Seriously? Me?
Yeah.
What do I know? But, I discovered coaching habits when I was probably a couple of years in to working as a coach.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just an absolute, sorry, I'm going to fanboy here for a little bit. I hope you don't mind.
No, I have a fragile male ego, so this is all necessary and good for me.
Excellent. I will help you move out of the cave of the imposter. I'm sure you need no assistance with. It was a perfect distillation of just a very straightforward, simple series of questions that you can, after time and practice, just reflexively fall back on in almost any one of those. Would you mind just giving me a little bit of, type questions? It's a water cooler conversation. It's a conversation with a senior executive, even at home, even with the kids. I mean, I use and what else with my 6-year-old all the time.
That's fantastic.
He loves it. He loves it. And then he's now using it back with me.
Exactly. Be careful what you
Yeah,
wish for.
I know. Um, but I mean, the whole sort of premise that you've really become renowned for is to use one of the sort of the quotes that I've seen attributed is you've done for curiosity what Brene Brown has done for vulnerability. Um,
I'm not sure that's exactly right. That's very flattering, but Brené Brown has done a lot for vulnerability. I aspire to do for curiosity what Brené Brown has done for vulnerability is probably a more accurate way of putting it, but thank you.
Sure. So Michael is on the journey
On
to
the
do for
journey.
curiosity. So I think just to throw the first sort of specific question out there today, what would you say the role of curiosity is to leaders who want to orientate themselves towards this grand purpose of making the world better?
Yeah. So I'd be bold enough to say that I think curiosity is just an essential leadership behavior. And of course, by leadership, I'm not talking about whether you're formally in a position of leadership, whether you're a VP of something or other. But if you have a chance to interact with other people, having curiosity as a recurring behavior is going to help on all sorts of levels. So if you start at just kind of how it's helpful for you to grow as a person, one of the things that you discover when you start kind of understanding your own operating system is how we love certainty and how we love advice and how we love clarity and how useful all of that can be so much of the time, but also how limited that can be so much of the time as well. And just do any cognitive kind of initial reading around cognitive biases, and you'll realize just how flawed your opinions and your advice and your certainty is so much of the time. In fact, there's a cognitive bias called the Dunning-Kruger effect, which in its kind of most blunt way is stupid people don't realize how stupid they are because they're too stupid. And the way that kind of plays out is the more certain you feel about something, the more likely it is that you may be completely wrong about that. So curiosity has the capacity to create empathy within you because you're more willing to be connected to the other person. You're more willing to be more strategic in terms of how you see the world because you're like, what actually is happening? What is the difference between the data and my opinions? It's more able to kind of innovate because it's like, where are the possibilities here for me? But I don't think the impact of curiosity is just on self, although I think that's kind of where we always have to start. Curiosity has an impact on how effective your team is, because it's like if I can have a team that is more curious, they're more likely to find the real stuff to be working on. And if they're working on the real stuff, they're more likely to be solving the important problems. And if they're solving the more important problems and they're more curious about what the solutions might be, they're more likely to have more impact in the world that they're having. So if you operate at that kind of team level and you're like, how do I make my team be more effective? You being more curious and you seeding curiosity as a key competency within that team, also a good thing. And even if you're at that kind of more senior level in your organization, like what would it be for our culture to be one that is curiosity led rather than advice driven? That gives you a chance to kind of go, we get to build a culture that is more agile, more human, more diverse in its thinking, more innovative, more resilient. So there's all sorts of levels in an organizational setting where curiosity makes more of a difference. But I think when it comes back to it, it's just like if you had to name the one thing, and this is in part thinking about you telling us that story about your 6-year-old around the curiosity around that and using, and what else when you're talking to your child. It at a most fundamental level, it allows you to stay connected to the humanness of other people. And in staying connected to the humanness of other people, you have a better chance of staying connected to your own humanness at all. And if you think, as I do, that work has a subtle but pervasive effect of slightly dehumanizing stuff because we're just trying to get stuff done, we're trying to produce it, we're driven by numbers. This is curiosity is the way that you remain kind of people positive and people centric in the interactions that you have.
Yeah. Okay. So yes, and there's a lot to get into.
Yeah. So we're violently agreeing with each other here. So this will be great.
Extremely violently. No, I think there's so much in there that I'm glad you've cleared the next 6 hours, and we're going to have an exhaustive conversation about. No, I think the thing that really stands out in all of that is the human element, and I think we are in this sort of great moment where we are definitely feeling polemic forces on the one hand, and I would say I'm kind of sitting right on the counterbalance over here. There's this very strong and I would say resurgent, but if not that, then emerging, sort of collectivization and really strong connection, which is being driven out of the fact that we need to be intentional about how we connect at the moment. But also, I think the fact that some of the sort of distractive pressures have started to subside.
Right.
We kind of got a moment to actually think, okay, what do I really want to do here?
Yeah.
And out of that is coming, well, actually, I need to connect more deeply, or I need to reconnect, or some version of. And I think the key challenge that certainly I have been observing and I've been wrestling with, in my work and with our work as an organization with our clients is how do leaders right now maintain connection and deepen the human experience of work when we're all interacting primarily digitally.
Yeah.
And how? So, what would your suggest? I'm going to use the word suggestions.
Yeah.
If we're going to try and stay away from our advice monsters, what would your suggestions be for how leaders could do that and deepen the connection during this particular moment? And as long as we're going to be using virtual digital tools, which is, let's face it, probably going to be permanently moving forward.
Well, that's a good question. And I'd go back to kind of first principles, which is like, okay, so what makes for human connection? What actually does that mean? Because I suspect actually the answer to that is agnostic to whether you're in person or whether you're coming through a screen or whether you're actually even doing it on text. I mean, it's like in a moment of communication, how do you make this feel human? Because, let's face it, we've all had in-person interactions that have felt dehumanizing and belittling. And we've also had kind of Zoom calls or even kind of text chatting where you feel connected and you feel seen and you feel heard. And I think that there is and so if you come to first principles, I go to the philosophy of Martin Buber, who I can't claim to be an expert in this, but I love his very profound, simple model that says there are two types of relationships you can have in this world. There's an I-it relationship and an I-thou relationship. So I-it is really, it's you and you've somehow objectified that other person. And you see them as a cog in the machine a little bit. Whereas I-thou relationships are where you feel fully connected to the full human in front of you. And to do that, you have to also be kind of connected to your own humanity as part of that. Right. So then the question is shifting slightly to going, so how do you build an I-thou relationship with other people? So that's hard. I mean, this is not an easy thing. This is hard work because there's 1,000 things pulling you away from that. But I do feel that there's probably, I'm going to guess and say 3 elements. One is a sense of self-awareness, and let's call it emotional intelligence because that's a label lots of us will understand, which is a sense of, do you see yourself? Do you see how you're reacting? Are you making some choices about how you show up and how you react and how you are in the moment? Because so often, and this is kind of the metaphor of the advice monster, which you've kind of hinted at a few times that show up in the Advice Trap book. So often our behavior is reactive and just responsive. And when we're doing that, we're not in an I-thou relationship. So I think there is a way of just, how do you keep working on yourself to go, who am I? What am I like at my best? How willing am I to be vulnerable and show my kind of complex messiness rather than putting up the mask. Then there's a piece around being present to the other person, which is, are you giving them, are you reminding yourself that they're a human being? They're probably doing the best that they can, that you're giving them grace and space and credit as best you can. How do you give them the space to step forward and show up as the full version of themselves? And I think that's where curiosity can be so powerful, because it can ask a question that allows them to actually step forward. And feels like there's a third thing there, and I'm wondering what it is. So there's something about being self-aware and working on that. There's something about being other-aware and being generous to them. In the Advice Trap book, I talk about these three pieces around humility and mindfulness, and I can't even remember what the third element is. Never mind. But I think there's something. Okay, there is also something about. So there's self, there's other, and then I think probably the third thing to be aware of is situation, and to understand how often in a situation we read it through our own biases. It's like we take a small piece of data and then we flesh it all out with judgment and opinion and interpretation, and how that can distort things because we now keep framing reality from only through our own filters, through our own biases. So there's also something about being connected to what's the reality that's going out there. And, the question I always think is powerful here is, well, what do I know to be true in this moment? So there's my stumbling answer to that, which is like, how do you do this? It's a really hard thing. But I do think this kind of combination of self-awareness, other awareness, situational awareness or reality awareness lay three foundations that allow you to perhaps be more present and more human to the people around you and to yourself.
So I think for me, that is a very eloquent synopsis.
Thank you.
And I could be so bold, in reciprocation of your boldness earlier on, to say, from what I live in my interactions, with the world that is largely defined by what our leaders make of it, in the way that I interact with the team that I lead and what I observe in the leaders that I work with. Essentially, what you've described is the difference between good leadership right now and bad leadership right now. So that's a bold statement for you.
Yeah.
Hopefully not brazen, but and I think what's then interesting, potentially for us to do is to look at, what is in what you've described and what is absent from it, and therefore the connotation of what is in the other area, what is in the bad area.
Yeah.
Because what you've described is absolutely all about self first, and sort of knowing thyself, and being aware of how you're receiving interactions, emotional stimuli, how you're interpreting them, and then how what you're projecting back out is equally being interpreted and impacting on the other side of whatever interaction you're having, as well as the awareness of the situation you're in. Are we in a stress charged situation? Well, yes, we probably are. Are we in a tactical situation? Is it a strategic one? Is it we need an outcome right now, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I think what's absent from everything that you described is a number of things. Explicit power, a sort of a classic hierarchical status of authority, and ultimately, stemming from those two things is control.
Yeah.
Right. Like, and I think this is that's one way to lead versus the other way to lead, and that other way to lead is really preeminent in a lot of leadership constructs that we see maybe not actually giving the desired outcome right now.
Well, I think part of the power of curiosity is it actually disrupts hierarchy, because what you're saying is, I'm willing to, essentially the trade-off is this: instead of giving you advice, I'm going to ask you a question. That's what staying curious a little bit longer looks like. When you are giving advice, you claim a position of authority. I know the answer. I am better placed than you to give you the answer. I need you to take my answer and act on it. It's my job to have the answer. And there's all sorts of implications in that in terms of what a hierarchy is and what power is and what control is. If you ask a question, and this is actually getting into why being curious is actually harder than it sounds, is you go, look, I am willing to give you the right to come up with the answer. I'm willing to give up a little bit of control on this conversation, because when I give the answer, I'm in control of the conversation. When I ask a question, suddenly it's a bit ambiguous as to how this thing's going to unfold and where we're going to go with it. You're also saying, I hope, when you come up with your answer, I'm willing to trust that that might be the right answer and giving you control and ownership of whatever the situation is. So curiosity has a kind of undercover act of rebellion to it. And I love that. Now, you said something interesting. You said something what was missing was about explicit power. And I think actually the interesting thing to do in organizational life is to make power more explicit rather than implicit, because mostly power and control lies as an invisible web in organizational life. We've all seen our org charts, but it'd be interesting to draw an org chart that was based on power and control rather than just nominal hierarchy.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I'm always curious to go, what if we made the way power works more explicit? That then allows us to question whether we want to do something about that or not. I'm the founder of Box of Crayons. I'm the founder of my new little company, mbs.works. I am a now middle-aged, tending towards old, straight, white, overeducated, articulate, English-speaking dude. So I've been dealt pretty much the full hand of privilege in terms of how this works. And part of my job, it feels like, as a teacher, but also as a leader within my context, is to go, how do I keep sharing power, and not just sharing power, but actually stepping away from power so that there's space for other people to step into it? And how do I do it in an explicit way so that people see me doing that? Because one of the things that I would love to be known for is a role model for how you give up power. What does that actually look like?
So would that be, and this is a sort of a confronting analogy for some, but I hope it's not inappropriate in a time when we are going through so much, sort of societal distress. But is that potentially going to be the MBS tombstone? Here lies he who was, known for, essentially sort of providing, a pathway for people to step away, from the need, I think is what it's so often sort of diagnosed as, to sort of, to cloister power and gather and hold on to it and clutch it as tightly as we can at all times.
Well, I've made arrangements to be buried in I think they call it a potter's field. So there won't be a tombstone. They're just, I'm just going to be wrapped in some paper, I think, or something, and like buried in some sort of thing, so I don't have the whole hoo-ha of coffins and headstones and the like, because I don't think anybody cares. But as a metaphor for that, I'm actually kind of less interested in what people say about me. I just would love it that there are more people who are now in positions of authority who might not otherwise have been in positions of authority. That's a far more, and whether they know that I had to do with that in some small minor way is neither here nor there. I look at, for instance, as a really kind of explicit piece, it's been a year or so since I stopped being the CEO at Box of Crayons. And the woman who took on that role, Shannon, we have worked really hard for actually 2 years, the year leading up to it and the year since, making sure her transition to power isn't undermined by the usual kind of shenanigans that founders like me get up to, which is like, I'm kind of giving up control, but I'm not really giving up control. And I'm just keeping my fingers in a few pies, and I'm just stepping back in to save the day when I feel anxious about it. And she and I have done a really, I think, a nice job. I'm quite really proud of the work we've done to go, how do we make your transition to power one that is a conscious, mindful choice where we keep being aware of how we might trip ourselves up. And Shannon, in her career at Box of Crayons, and if she goes on to have other careers, because she's talented enough to be brilliant anywhere, my contribution to her stepping into her full glory, awesome. Very proud of that.
Yeah, and that's yeah, I think that again, that's the good versus the bad. You know, it's the classic analogy of a leader's job is to create leaders, you know, not to essentially sort of design a structure which propels them in one singular upward direction.
Right. You know, I'm part of quarantine. Part of what I set for myself as a commitment for the year, I had 3 principles. One is to under the headline be exuberant. Under the headline is cut loose, because this is a year of cutting loose from my time at Box of Crayons and cutting loose also in that sense of just being more expressive. And I had 3 principles. One is be a host. One is be exuberant. And the other is create big and small. So I've had this kind of commitment this year to keep trying to create stuff. Not necessarily with a specific outcome in mind, just for the joy and discipline of creating. And one of the things that I've loved doing in this quarantine period is on LinkedIn, I've been putting out a series called Quarantine Poems with MBS. And the poem I read yesterday and put out was Percy Bysshe Shelley's poem Ozymandias, which is this great poem about the arrogance of assumptive power. And I don't know it well enough to kind of quote it line by line, but there is this piece where, you know, here's the story in the poem. You know, a traveler in a barren land comes across a fallen statue, and then this arrogant face lying on the sand, you get this cold sneer of the lip. And on the pedestal is the saying, "My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look at my works, ye mighty, and despair." You know, it's that kind of proclamation around, I am it. And then this is the twist. He goes, and as you look around, the desert stands stretched long and far and bare to the horizon. It's like it's all fallen. It's all gone. You know, nothing remains of this leader's empire other than his fallen statue. It's so good. It's such a great poem, and it's a sonnet, so it's like 14 lines of brilliance. And I do think there's a, you know, if you have the luck and if you have privilege, one of the things that I think is a really interesting challenge is to go, how do you start toppling your own statue? Like, I'm more interested in toppling my statue than I am in trying to build my statue. I mean, that makes me sound more kind of, you know, noble or saint-like than I actually am, because I'm also interested in building my statue as well. I've got some of that for sure. But the bigger win is to figure out how to topple my statue and have other people build their statues, which are much more interesting.
I think the challenge with that, I love the analogy, and it's a fantastic poem. I think that the sort of the inherent challenge in that desire is, it's not to say that it's duplicitous, but you know, if you don't build the statue high enough, no one will notice when it falls, right? You know, it's like the tree in the forest thing, you know. So, and especially in this era of infinite content and, you know, this perpetual data creation spike that's just, you know, forever going up and up and up. You know, I think I think for me, the question would be more, you know, why are you building the statue? What is the purpose of the statue? When will the statue be high enough? And then what is the purpose of giving it a shove, and what will it achieve when it falls, and so on and so
Well,
on, right?
I'd be thinking, I'd work on the assumption of, what if it was true that I already have a statue? So like I am let's call me a mid-level B-list celebrity. I've written some books and they've sold better than most books, but almost nobody really knows who I am. I'm not like Brene Brown or somebody kind of at that next level, and she's not like Michelle Obama and whatever. So there's always somebody who has a bigger statue than you.
Sure.
But if you go, look, let's say I have a statue. So no matter where you sit, you're old, you're young, you're senior, you're just starting up. If you think to yourself, what if my goal was to distribute power and play with power and recognize what I have, rather than going, look, I'm just going to grab power for a while, and then when I'm rich in however you want to, whatever that means to you, then I'll start giving it away. Because the challenge with that is, you're like, yeah, I fully intend to start giving stuff away, but not quite yet, because I just want a little bit more, because when I've got that little bit more, then I'll be finally ready. And I'm like, you know what? What if you started now? What would it mean to disrupt how things work in your sphere of influence by playing with how power works? And I think for some people, that actually means, how do you step forward and claim a spotlight that you may not be stepping forward into at the moment? And for others, it's like, how do you step out of that? And it can just be present in the simplicity of a team meeting, whether it's done through Zoom or in real life. However, going, what does the dynamic of this team meeting tell us about how power works in this team? And what could I do to shift it, to make it feel holistically like a space where there's more of an I-thou relationship than an I-it relationship?
Yeah, no, I totally hear the distinction, and again, I think the thing that I'm receiving out of your comments there is, it's really about leadership being an act of service.
That's nice.
And
Yeah.
It's not so much a transfer of power as a sort of an opening up of power, and a sort of again, I use this term collectivization a lot. That if the role of leaders is to connect a collective that together in an act of service can go on whatever the mission is and achieve whatever the purpose they sort of decide is going to be the purpose they're pursuing. Well, wouldn't that create something interesting and different and divergent, and to reference another one of your terms, sort of cut loose a little bit from what we just do because it's what we've always done. And I think that would be an accomplishment in of itself. And as someone who tries to innovate, talking to someone who is an innovator, maybe let's talk a little bit about the role of failure in that process, right? Because if we're going to cut loose, we're wandering off the rails.
Yeah, for sure.
And we're going to go into the unknown to an extent, and we're going to have a go. So what is the role of failure in sustaining this endeavor and in remaining curious? Because I think, a fear of failure can kill curiosity flat,
for sure.
Before you get very far at all.
So when I think about failure, I think about a couple of things. One is, one of the things that's, here are the two things that are liberating for me and that allow me to be more sanguine about an outcome that is not the one I was hoping for. The first is risk analysis, which is to, as you embrace on something, it's like to do some risk analysis, to go, what's the potential downside of this? What is at risk? And often it's some combination of money and reputation and ego and status, and maybe relationships. But often our fear, what's at risk, is amplified, in part because that's just our brain. That's our little amygdala going, look, your brain is set up to to avoid risk, because with risk comes a chance of death, and with death comes the knowledge that your DNA doesn't get passed on, and your brain only has one goal, which is like, get the DNA passed on. That's what I'm here for. So, there's all sorts of, it's a cognitive bias, which is we are risk averse. We'd rather avoid losing $100 than we would gaining $100. So being willing to kind of disrupt your own brain's chemistry to go, let me actually get clear about what's at risk and what's really at risk. And almost everything I've done that's gone on to be a success, I've got to a point where I'm like, I'm comfortable with it being a failure, because I know what's at risk is some money I've invested in it that I've chosen to go, I may never get that money back. It is, if this goes belly up, how will this impact my reputation? And honestly, quite often I go, look, people love stories of failure and redemption. So even if this fails, this just gives me a great story to tell around how I rose from the ashes, or how I reinvented myself, or how I moved on to the next thing. It's rare. If things fail because they just fail, if they fail because you're out of integrity and you're corrupt, that's different. But if you fail because you're like, we tried to do this thing and it just, we did our best, we put our cards on the table and we lost. That's actually a story that sells. That's actually builds your reputation. So I think risk analysis is part of it, which is like, look at the risk and be clear about whether the risks are as terrible and as dangerous as you think. Sometimes they are, and it's worth knowing that. The other piece for me is understanding that what you get to control is the process, not the outcome. So this goes right back to Viktor Frankl and Man's Search for Meaning, which is you don't get a choice about your circumstance. You don't get a choice about the outcome of something that you do. You get to work the process. So once you decide to try something out, your job is to work the process as best you can. Give it your totally your best shot. And if it works, fantastic. If it doesn't, fantastic. Because if you can go, well, I gave it all I could, like I'm really proud of how I went for that, then you win. And if you've done the risk analysis and you've worked the process, no matter how this plays out, you're like, you can sleep well at night and you can just go, this is terrific. I had this conversation with Shannon, the CEO at Box of Crayons, and she's like, she was like, I'm kind of worried because, I'm not sure, I can't think of anything else to do. So I'm kind of lying awake going, what else should I be worrying about? And I'm like, let's take that same situation and just flip it to go, you have looked at the process, you've looked at the goal, the project that you're working on, and you're giving it your all, and there's nothing else for you to do. Fantastic. Now you can actually just sleep really well at night because you're like, everything within my control, I am working as best I can. How do that's it. And then you get to, part of this is about just getting to accept your powerlessness. You're like, you get to control very little. You get to influence more than you think. So work your influence. But then there's this vast amounts of stuff that you can neither control nor influence. So why worry about that?
So that is another fantastic, not advice, because we're not using that word.
Just to be clear, I am pro advice. The whole thing about the advice trap is not a kind of scree against advice. It's against having an immediate response that is reactive and not thoughtful, and it's advice driven. So look, the whole point of a podcast is to give advice. If it was just asking questions of each other, it'd be pretty boring pretty fast.
Yeah, let's adopt a pure coaching orthodoxy, Michael, and just throw questions at each other for an hour and see how we go.
So you guys crazy first.
No, I know, and I'm just going to kind of dive straight into the advice trap for a moment, because my sort of journey with it, having I did pre-ordered it, was that one of the fundamental consistent errors that I made early on in my career when I was, being surprised that I was being asked questions, was to do exactly one of the things that you make so abundantly clear is dangerous to do, which is just to respond to the request that is put to you, maybe because you can, but certainly because you feel like it's just efficient and it's quick and it solves the problem. But in point of fact, you're actually not solving the problem at all. You're simply answering a question. And it aligned. So my discovery of that in your book aligned with some work I was doing with Shane Parrish in one of his courses.
Farnham Street, which is fantastic, right?
Farnham Street, which is fantastic. And if anybody hasn't, had a look at Shane's work and the team there, please do. But he talks about the root problem, and one of his decision-making frameworks, and it's very, very similar. Like, actually, have you done the work to understand, is this just, wallpapering over the cracks for a while, or can we get right into the cracks and actually sort of build the foundations up? And I think a lot of your guidance around that is along those lines.
There is a place for advice, but you've got to know what the traps of advice are. And the first trap of advice is that you're probably trying to solve the wrong problem because you haven't interrogated what the real challenge is. You just assume that the first thing that gets presented is the real thing, and it really almost never is. The second trap of advice is overrating how good your advice is. It's not nearly as good as you think it is. It comes with all sorts of biases. You've misheard the problem. This worked once for you years ago. But even if you have the right problem, and even if you have an amazing piece of advice that is exactly awesome, the third challenge with advice is the thing we've been talking about for the bulk of this conversation, which is it the right leadership act? Because there's a risk to say, look, even if I know what the right solution is, there's a short-term win of like, I give you a good answer and you get out of here and you go and do it. There's a longer-term price that gets paid, which is you are building a dependency on you to people coming to you for the answer. And again, there's absolutely a time and a place for this, but it is the leadership act of giving advice is an overused muscle. The leadership act of staying curious a little bit longer and potentially even giving them the option to come up with their own answer, and it might not even be quite as good as yours, but allowing them to run with it has a potentially just such a bigger payoff because it's like compound interest. Like, you're building a sense of competence and confidence and autonomy and self-sufficiency, and that can be really powerful.
No, fantastic. I'm getting a little bit conscious of the duration of our fascinating conversation.
We've been going for a while.
We've been going for a while. And there's two questions that are now burning a hole in my brain, and I'm not going to be able to hold back on them. One is about learning, and I'd like to kind of get to that in a minute, but mentioning Shane's course, just sort of prompted that for me. Because to one of your earlier comments, like, I feel like I have a connection to him and that community because of a purely digital learning experience that I'm having, right? So I think that would be an interesting thing for us to examine and also bring us to talk to some of the work that you're doing at the moment. But right before we get there, and this is a question that I've been sort of holding here. I could have thrown it out a couple of times, but do you think that the questions we ask ourselves are more important than the questions we ask others?
Well, it kind of depends on the question a little bit and depends on you a little bit. The slipperiness, the power of coaching is in part an externalized act of somebody asking you a question, because it's just much harder to be slippery about it. I find that when I ask myself questions, I'm evasive, and the Michael who asked the question lets the slippery Michael who's avoiding answering the question off the hook too easily. So that's part of the power of, I'm just holding up my little bullet journal that I use to kind of check in. And I check in every day with 3 questions. I will let go of. I am grateful for. So they're statements, but they're really, what are you what will you let go of? What are you grateful for? What will you focus upon? And I write them down because it it just makes physical my response. And it makes it a commitment rather than a loosey-goosey, I've kind of half answered in my head, but I haven't really. So I think you have, in the end, the only questions that really matter to you are the questions that are asked of you. The next question is like, what's the best forum for those questions? In what way is the best way for those questions to land with you? And it might be a coach. It might be that you program Siri so that you go, Siri, ask me a good question. And Siri goes, okay, Tim, what's the real challenge here for you? Or whatever it might be. It might be that you have the discipline to write a question and then answer a question in a journal. But, the most interesting things are the really hard questions for you to wrestle with. What do you want? What will you say yes to? What will you say no to? What are you willing to sacrifice? Those are the kind of big existential questions that open the portal to a life well lived.
Yeah, no, I think that's the key. It's the toughness of the questions that you ask yourself. I mean, this is my sort of classic rebuttal. When I'm in a sort of a pre-engagement conversation about coaching, and people are like, "Oh, but you're just going to ask me the questions that I know I should be asking myself." And I said, "Yeah, that is part of it, but you actually have to answer them." Because it's somebody else sitting across from you. And also, I'm going to ask you tough questions that maybe you're asking yourself, or maybe you're not. But if you are, perhaps you're not prepared to answer them. So no, that's thank you for responding to my tangential, deliberate question. So let's talk about learning. Again, it's an interesting time at the moment. We've seen an absolute explosion of virtual, online. Everybody's got a digital version of. You've been teaching for a very, very long time.
Thanks.
Not that long.
Exactly,
Come on.
I feel like the ancient mariner.
I've got plenty of grey here and here. Don't worry. So what would you say the opportunity is, for leaders that are looking to explore these topics that we've covered today, to go on and to learn about them, when maybe they can't, rock up to a seminar, or it's going to be tricky for them to do something, in a forum that they're used to, but there's so much out there. Try Googling learn about curiosity. There's going to be 500,000
for sure.
Sort of course options and whatever. What would your advice be?
Well, there are different types of learning out in the world. Sometimes you need to learn some technical expertise, and you can just download that, watch a YouTube video. I mean, I read a statistic that 70% of millennials don't see their organization as their primary source of learning. It's because they see YouTube as their primary source of learning. They're like, okay, how do I play this song? Like, I've got a little ukulele down there. I'm like, how do I play this song? I go into YouTube and somebody teaches it to me and I learn it. And that's great. So there's a way that there can be a very kind of technical exchange of content that happens digitally. And there's a bazillion pieces of evidence around that. I think for some of the more nuanced stuff, and by nuance, I really mean it's actually less about what you know, it's more about what you do differently as a result. I mean, if you look at the Coaching Habit book, there's a way that I can give you that content in about 5 minutes. It's like, let me list the 7 questions that I tell you are the 7 essential questions. Let me teach you the habit formula, which is around how you build a new habit. Let me give you the 8 ways to ask a question well that will change the way that you ask the question. So you've got the good question, and here's how you ask it, and here's how you make it a habit. That's like a 500-word blog post if I was really, really succinct about it. That doesn't create behavior change. And in fact, books don't really create behavior change. And if you're building a learning experience, you've got to go, what does it take to change the way you act? And that is typically a little bit of knowledge, a little bit of practice, a little bit of feedback, a little bit of community engagement. And then you go, so whatever platform whatever experience you're using, do I get all of those elements that are more likely to shift somebody's behavior? And for sure, you can do that on in classroom experiences, but absolutely you can do it digitally as well. I mean, Box of Crayons is rolling out a digitally based learning piece around coaching skills for Microsoft, for thousands and thousands of people in Microsoft. And 93% of people are saying their behavior is shifting as a result of being part of that program. And that's because the program is some energetic videos from me, but also the team at Microsoft have set up structures that go, it's a 5-week course, you go through it in cadres, you go through it in a big group of people, but you're also in a small group of 5 people. There's regular check-ins with that group of 5 people, so there's accountability. There's a way of practicing and reflecting on your practice, so you got feedback. Microsoft, the team there, and Andrea as the leader there, has built out an experience that increases the odds of behavior change.
Yeah. No, that's a fantastic portrayal, and I think that's the crux of it. And certainly, it always concerns me, when I'm speaking to the classic example would be, the head of organizational development, and we're talking about, what are you doing to achieve this specific organizational objective by developing capacity and capability around leadership and la la la. And they'll typically, a lot of the time, list a set of skills and then saying we're providing our people with this information. I mean, that's the essence of what they say. They might say, "Oh, well, we've given them access to LinkedIn Learning, or we've downloaded all of this effectively literature for them to sit in front of and consume." And the response is generally, "How will you reach your outcome? What will that content do to activate the behavior?"
I mean, content is very seductive. It's advice, and we go, if I add more advice, that will help. And actually, for me, and this is very kind of congruent with the curiosity piece, when I am designing learning, one of my design principles is, what's the least I can teach that is the most useful? And it forces me to confront my own insecurity about, am I giving them enough? To say, if I'm truly in service of the group, actually what they need is space to absorb and practice and kind of get this stuff in their bones. What they don't need is me effectively pouring water into a full glass, going, look how much value I'm adding by pouring more water into this already overflowing glass.
Yeah, absolutely. So can we talk a little bit about what you are doing with your new endeavor, mbs.works?
So it's been an interesting year of kind of thinking about the repositioning, and I think I've just landed on the promise that I want to make people. And promise is this: don't regret a life half lived. Like, I want people to be living a really full life. I want them to kind of get to that point where they're like, man, I squeezed the lemon here. And so we do that in a number of ways. I do a bunch of stuff that's basically teaching led, like putting books out in the world. But really, I'm excited about trying to have people start building their own better life for themselves. So one of the things that's on offer at the mbs.works is this program called the Year of Living Brilliantly. It's totally free. 52 diverse, interesting, powerful teachers. And each week you get a short video, 2 to 6 minutes of their kind of them teaching their best stuff. But really the power comes from the questions that provoke interaction with that content, and then the community that's building up around that, encouraging and nurturing and kind of deepening the inquiry as to whatever the lesson is. So I'm kind of really proud of it, because I love how interesting the faculty is. And I love that we've got now thousands of people going through it and who are kind of enthusiastic about it.
And look, not that you need it by any means, because it's already a great success, but just a little bit of advocacy and feedback, because before I even invited you, to make the most of your quarantining, I'd started my own journey with the Year of Living Brilliantly, and it is doing all of the things that you've just described. And the key to me, and again referencing back to one of your sort of key ingredients of successful learning, there is a great community there. and even in the early stages, the interaction, that I've had and given, just that kind of comment on a comment, that is there, and it's very sincere, and it has been provocative, and it has deepened the learning experience. So thumbs up from me, certainly. No, very, very good. So in terms of anybody who perhaps again one of those 1 or 2% who I'm going to keep inverting it, who weren't aware of you before this conversation, what's the best way for people to now dial in, really immerse themselves in the MBS world? Would it be to head to the website?
mbs.works is the real place to go. It's the kind of a hub. You'll see, we're just redesigning the website a bit at the moment, so depending on when you're listening to this, but you're going to see a chance to sign up for a newsletter if you get that. It's a weekly newsletter. There's a Year of Living Brilliantly for sure. Grab hold of that, because I think it's all free and it's a great resource. And then if you want to find my books, go to a bookstore, go to Amazon, go to an alternative to Amazon. And if you type in my complicated name, Michael Bungay Stanier, or The Coaching Habit, or The Advice Trap, or Do More Great Work, you'll see the books that I'm best known for.
Yeah, perfect. I'm just going to ask, if I may, one final question, and then we will score a line under this. If you could give a couple of specific, actionable, even if they're questions, rather than specific pieces of guidance. But if somebody's sitting at the end of this conversation thinking, okay, I like, listening to these conversations. I'm here because I'm a leader who wants to make the world better. What would you say that they could go on and do, or just ask themselves, referencing what we've covered today?
Sure. I'll give you three possible calls to action. One might be around you listening to this and going, this idea of being more coach-like sounds interesting. How do I start doing that? And what I would say is pick one question and start practicing it. It might be, and what else? You heard Tim talk about that at the start. It might be, what's on your mind, which is a great opening question. It might be finishing a conversation with what was most useful or most valuable here for you. But don't try and change the world. Just pick a question and go, let me see if I can ask it 1 or 3 or 5 times a day. So that's one possibility for you. If the conversation about power has kind of struck a chord for you, then you might just sit with it and go, just do an audit, which is like, how do you think power works now in your little sphere? Make explicit what is currently a little bit hidden. And what's your role in this? Where do you fit in this? Are you, is it your place to step forward and see how you can claim the power that is yours to claim? Is it your step to step back and go, how do I invite others in to share the power or use the power or engage in the power in a different way? So I would interrogate how power works. That's a more challenging task, but potentially more far-reaching in terms of its impact. And the third piece might be simply, if you're in the world of design, and you're thinking about how you can make your courses better, you might be going, if I had to cut 30% of my content, what would I cut? Because most courses suffer from too much stuff. And do you have enough space for practice that leads to behavior change?
Perfect. I might go a little bit further and say, if you could only keep 5% of your content, what would you keep? Start there.
Exactly.
Somebody asked me that question of something that we were putting together, and it was a fascinating practice to go and actually apply it. And what was reassuring was when we came back to them with a response, they said, okay, well, actually, we do need a bit more than that. But that's good. Okay, so thank you very much, everybody. Please do go and check out the Year of Living Brilliantly. I absolutely advocate for that. And Michael, again, thank you for your time and your advice and your wisdom. And I hope we will have a chance to talk again at some stage. You'll find audio and video recordings for this episode, as well as links and related resources mentioned today in the podcast area of 4iLeadership.com/insights. This is the Better World Leaders podcast, brought to you by 4i Leadership.